Welcome back to our course on Project 2016. In this section we're going to start to look at resources. Resources include the people involved in a project, they include equipment and materials used, and various other types of resource, notably costs associated with a project. When you look at a Gantt chart such as this one, you're primarily looking at tasks. The table on the left gives information about the tasks, and the chart on the right gives a pictorial, a graphical representation of the scheduling of the tasks, their durations, dependencies, and so on. Now, tasks and resources are basically the two building blocks of a project in Microsoft Project 2016, and we link the two together using what are called assignments or resource assignments. In this section we're going to look at resources, and in the next section we're going to look at resource assignments. One thing that you may have noticed when we were using the View tab before is that the first two groups on the left are task views and resource views. And largely speaking, when we're looking at a project, we tend to be looking at tasks or at resources. But there are many views that enable us to look at both, and in particular to look at the relationship between them. Usually so far when we've been looking at tasks, we've used Gantt chart view, and for most people that is the view that they use most of the time. Of the resource views, a very popular view is resource sheet view, and that's the one that we're going to look at first. So if I click on resource sheet, this spreadsheet gives us information about all of the resources in our project, and at the moment, as you can see, we have no resources in our project. Now we're going to start to add some resources in just a moment. But before we do, just look down at the right hand end of the status bar. Two of the main icons there are on the left here, the button to take us to Gantt chart view, and three to the right, the one that looks just like a spreadsheet, that one takes us back to resource sheet view. So you'll probably get used to switching between those two. The two views between them are also very commonly used. Task usage, which basically lists tasks and shows which resources are used in a task, and at the moment we have no resources, so there's nothing being used. And the next one is Team Planner view, which can enable us to look at how the work on a project is distributed between a team. Now at the moment we have no team because we have no resources to put into a team. So let's go back to resource sheet view. The two main projects that I'm using on this course differ in many ways, and perhaps the biggest difference is in the resources that they use and the way that they use those resources. In the case of a wedding, some of the people resources involved, which would for example be the bride and groom, won't be charging for their time, and also the wedding won't involve using lots of consumable materials, not in any case in the way that a building project, a bathroom refit project would use materials such as paint and floor tiles and that kind of thing. The difference is going to be even bigger when we start looking at costs, because when it comes to costs, for example, the bride and groom wouldn't expect to charge their time on this project to people, whereas the people working on the bathroom refit will be charging their time to whoever is paying for the bathroom refit. So there are many differences between these two projects in relation to how they handle resources and the associated costs. But I hope that by dealing with two such different projects we're going to deal with many of the situations that you're likely to come across in future when using Project 2016. As we add resources to the resource sheet, each row on the sheet represents a resource, and each column represents a property of that resource. The first resource that I'm going to add to this project is the bride. And first of all I need to say what type of resource the bride is. There are basically three choices: work, material and cost. And as we're going to see, This is not always a particularly easy choice to make. Generally speaking, people are entered onto the resource sheet as work resources because they do work. And whether or not they charge for that work is a separate matter. But we expect them to perform tasks and complete work, rather than, as in the case of, say, materials, be consumed by a job, used up in doing a particular task. Or a cost, where we basically say with a task that it has a certain cost, but isn't necessarily performed by an individual or involve the consumption of some kind of material. Now, we're going to see examples of each of these three resource types, but we're going to work for the moment on the principle that when we add people, we're adding work resources generally. Now, when I choose a type for a resource, I will get a different accessible selection of properties here. So, for instance, when I declare that a particular resource is a work resource, I can specify their standard rate, and the standard rate here is $0 per hour, and I can specify their overtime rate. Now, as I mentioned just now, the bride is not going to be charging for her time on this project, so we don't need to assign a standard rate or overtime rate for the bride. We do, however, need to declare how many brides we have, and we only have one, and she is represented by 100%. If I were dealing with, say, bricklayers, and I was building a house, I might say I've got 3 bricklayers, so that's 300%, and I could say the standard rate that it costs me to employ those bricklayers, and then I can also enter an overtime rate. I also have here a cost per use. So if a particular resource has cost per use, so for example, if I'm dealing with something where there's a setup fee, perhaps a delivery fee or a contract fee or a hiring fee or something, a one-off cost, I can specify that here. And I will normally also specify an accrual method. Now for the moment I want you to ignore accrual, and I also want you to ignore the next column, which is the calendar that this particular resource uses, which by default is our standard base calendar. Now, we're not looking at calendars at the moment, so just ignore both accrue and base. Now, when it comes to using any resource on a project, it's always a good idea to give that resource initials whereby we can identify that resource, for example, on a Gantt chart. So, for the bride, I'm literally just going to put bride as the initials. So that's my first resource set up. Now it would only seem right to add the groom as my second resource. So my project now has 2 resources. The next resource I'm going to set up is a little bit controversial really. I'm not really sure you do it this way, but you certainly could do it this way. And I'm going to add a resource wedding ring. And I'm going to say that it is a material resource. You could actually work it that way. It may seem a little bit heartless in a way, but let's call it a material resource. And I'm going to give it an initials of ring. And note that when I chose material, some of the other fields, some of the other properties changed. So for instance, max was cleared out. It no longer said 100%, the default for a work resource, because we're not talking about having a maximum number of rings. We can basically buy as many rings as we want, subject to available funds, of course. And similarly, the standard rate changed from being dollars per hour to just dollars, because we're not talking about a rate of pay for somebody, for a work resource, a person. We're talking about the cost of a material. When you're dealing with costs for materials, you also declare what units the cost refers to. So if instead of wedding rings I was dealing with building bricks, I might record a cost here for 1,000 bricks. And what I would put here in the material column might well be 1,000 for 1,000 bricks. For the price for a ring will be a price per ring. And let's suppose that the price I'm working on here is $500 per ring. And that is all the information I need to set up that material resource. So at whatever point I decide to buy one or more wedding rings in my project, the cost will be recorded in the project as $500 per ring. Now for an example of a cost resource, and it's going to seem now as though I'm disagreeing with what I said earlier in this section. Sometimes a person working on a project is not really working on it as though they were, say, a builder, or in this case the bride or groom, somebody who's directly involved in a number of tasks on the project. What they are doing is more of, if you like, a service. So I might choose to make the photographer or videographer for this project a service, a cost to the project. We're not talking about paying this person by the hour, we're talking about their standard charge for photographing or videoing a wedding. So in this case, I'm going to add a resource photographer and not deal with the photographer as though he or she is a person working on the project, but deal with them as a service to the project, a cost to the project. So on this occasion, I'm going to make the type cost. The initials I'm going to apply are photo. Now you notice there that there is no highlighted cost rate field with $0.00 or whatever as we had before for work or material resources. And in fact, the best way to record the cost of a cost resource in a particular situation is to assign that cost when you assign the resource to the task. And I'm going to show you how to do that a little bit later on. At the moment, the important thing is that we have listed our cost resource here, photographer, and of course with this project there will be many other cost resources. It's true to say in this particular case that many of the resources, things like wedding dress and even wedding ring, might reasonably be considered to be costs rather than materials. But as I said earlier on in this section, sometimes it's actually quite a difficult decision to make, and you'll certainly find that you have your own approach to determining which is the best way of dealing with resources on your own projects. Having set up a few resources there, we're going to do a little bit of resource assignment in the next section. But there's one more thing to show you in this section. If I select one of the resources, note that there is a resource tab, and one of the options on the resource tab is information, and that brings up the resource information dialog, which is a direct parallel to the task information dialog, except of course this one relates to resources. As with the task information dialog, you have a number of tabs, and these tabs have already got the information we've entered so far on, but of course there's other information that you can add, some of which we'll be looking at a little bit later on in the course. There are of course other ways of getting at this resource information. You can right click and there is an information option on the contextual menu, and of course just double clicking on a resource brings up the resource information dialog as well. That's it for resources for the moment. I'll see you in the next section.
To get the Project 2016 course exercise and instructor demo file, click the link below in the video details. You can also scroll through the video details to find each section for this course, in addition to the playlist for the complete course for Microsoft Project 2016. Finally, if you're enjoying this training, please leave us a thumbs up and some comments. Now, let's continue with our Microsoft Project training.
Hello again and welcome back to our course on Project 2016. In this section we're going to look at the basics of assigning resources to tasks. In the previous section we set up a few resources for the wedding project. Clearly there are going to be many more. But let's switch back to Gantt chart view using the button towards the right hand end of the status bar. And I'm going to choose one of the tasks and assign resources to it. Select Agree Budget and Approach, right click, and click Assign Resources. Now that brings up the Assign Resources dialog, and in the dialog you can see a list of the available resources. Later on in the course we'll look at the fact that as the number of resources available in a project grows, you may need to filter this list in order to find the particular resource or resources that you need. But at the moment we've got such a short list of resources that it's easy to find the one that we want to assign. I'm going to assign the bride and groom to this task. I'm going to work on the principle that the bride and groom are arranging this wedding themselves. I appreciate that in many situations it will perhaps be family members or other relations or friends that will be doing some or all of the organising, but I'm trying to make this not too complicated. To assign a resource, all I need to do is to select that resource. In this case, the bride is already selected, and then click on Assign. Now when I assign a resource to a task like that, it doesn't automatically close the Assign Resources dialog. You note there a separate close button. But what you can see is, first of all, the number of units. Well, 100% represents one bride, so there's one bride attached to that task, which is just as well really, because we only have one bride available. And the cost of the bride working on that task is 0. Don't forget that the rate for the bride chargeable to this project is $0 per hour. So if she's working on that task for 10 days, then she's still not going to charge us any money for doing it. Now, one very important point I'd like you to bear in mind here, and this is going to become increasingly important later in the course, is that the 100% means that the bride is working on this task full time. Now in reality it may well be that she is not working full time and that she's actually doing her day job most of the time, and she's just spending a certain amount of time working on, in this case, the budget and approach to her wedding. But for the purposes of this particular project, and this will not be the case for the bathroom refit, but for the purposes of this project, all I'm going to do is treat that 100% as being all of the time that she has available. That doesn't mean to say it's a 40-hour week or an 8-hour day or anything else. It just means that all of the time she's got available, she is going to spend on that task while that task is in progress. Now fortunately, while that task is in progress, she doesn't actually have any other tasks on the wedding, so she can spend all of her time on it. If I want to assign a second resource, and the most obvious second resource to assign is the groom, I'm going to select the groom and do the same thing. Click on Close, and the bride and groom are now assigned to that task. One of the consequences of assigning the bride and groom to that task is to do with the amount of work involved in that task. I pointed out to you much earlier on in the course that when you look at work, particularly for a new project, and particularly when this project was new, in the work column there was 0 hours of work because we had no resources assigned to that task. As far as Project 2016 is concerned, we have now taken a 10-day task and it defaults to an 8-hour working day, so 10 days for 8 hours a day is 80 hours, and when I assign 2 people to it full time, that is 160 hours of work. So as far as Project 2016 is concerned, these 2 resources are going to do 160 hours of work on this task. Now when you do this, and the reasons for this will become apparent in the next section, when you do this and you effectively increase the amount of work from 0 hours to 160 hours, Project 2016 offers you alternative ways of dealing with the change that you've made. And that little exclamation mark on the left there, with the drop down next to it, offers you alternative ways of dealing with a situation where you've increased the amount of work in a task. As far as the wedding project is concerned, this is of little interest really, because we're not really going to charge for the bride and groom's time. So the costings and in fact the scheduling of this is not going to be changed by the fact that we've assigned 2 resources to that task. We're not going to say that because the bride and groom are working on it, it's only going to take half the time. We decided it was a 10-day task and that was it. We don't make it a 5-day task because 2 people are working on it. That set of arguments about work and duration and the amount of work in a task and so on is what we're going to look at in the next section. And I hope that that section will explain to you why we get these options here and in fact which of these options is the right one to choose. But on this occasion we're going to go for the default option, which is increase the amount of work but keep the same duration. When we do that, Project 2016 is quite happy. The warning's gone away, we've got our 160 hours of work, we've still got a 10-day task, and the bride and groom are assigned to that task. My main concern over the next few sections is going to be the scheduling of this wedding and the scheduling of projects in general. And in fact, it's the assignment of work resources that will be the key factor. For the balance of this section, I'm just going to quickly show you a couple of other ways of assigning resources, and we're going to assign those other 2 resources that we set up, one cost resource and one material resource, just to go through the basics of dealing with those. We'll be coming back to cost and material resources later though, as I really do want to concentrate on work resources and scheduling now. Let's go down to the photography section. And let's suppose that I want to assign the photographer to the select and book photographer task. So I'm going to assign the cost of the photographer to this task. On the resource tab, one of the buttons is assign resources. And that brings up the assign resources dialog, and from here I can assign the photographer. Now don't forget that when I assign the photographer, we don't have a cost assigned because it's a cost resource and we haven't specified what that cost is until we actually assign it to the task. Now we're going to allow for the fact that the photographer, videographer we're going to use is going to charge around about $1,500. So enter $1,500, click somewhere else, and we have a cost of $1,500. Having done that, click on close, and that resource is assigned to the task. Note how the cost appears in brackets after photographer. I should point out to you, by the way, that what you see on the Gantt chart on the right, the words to the right of the blocks in this case, this is all customizable, and we will be looking at customizing the Gantt chart later on in the course. The last assignment that I would like to make here is the assignment of the rings. So I'm going to go to select and buy rings and right click. I'm going to use this approach to getting the assign resources dialog. And on this occasion I'm going to choose ring, and I'm going to actually assign the number of rings because we're actually going to buy 2 rings. Note how, as I use that roller there, the units I've specified for rings, which is the text that I put in the material column on the resource sheet, is shown. You can just about see it there. It's saying 2 rings. You can just about make it out. You'll see it better in just a moment. Click on assign, and as you can see, 2 rings, and it knows that each ring we've allowed $500 for, so that's $1,000 for 2 wedding rings. The other important thing to bear in mind here is that I could at the same time assign the bride and groom to this task as well. So if I select bride, hold the control key down, select groom, click on assign, and now click on close, I've got 3 resources assigned to that task. I've got the bride and groom work resources and material resource, 2 wedding rings, and note the units there, 2 ring. That's the basics of assignments. In the next section we're going to turn our attention back to work, and we're going to look at work with particular reference to different types of task. That's it for this section. I'll see you then. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Project 2016. Now that you know how to assign resources to tasks, the next thing we need to move on to is producing a workable schedule given the resources that are available. In order to do that, there are a couple of fundamental things that you need to understand, and perhaps the most important thing to understand with Project 2016 is the different task types that can be involved in projects. Now, in order to illustrate this, I'm using a sort of dummy project, just a very simple project with 3 tasks in it, A, B and C. Currently they're each 2-day tasks, and a resource, Jane, is working on those tasks, and Jane is working for 8 hours a day. So on task A, Jane is doing 16 hours work, task B 16 hours work, C 16 hours work, and so on. Now let's suppose that I provide Jane with some help. I say, Jane, John is going to help you. If I assign John to task A, what do you think would happen? Now what may happen is you may look at it and say, well, obviously Jane's going to be able to get that job done in half the time. So instead of being a 2-day task, it's going to be a 1-day task. And obviously that is one option. But there are a couple of other options as well. One other option is that if John works on that task as well, it will still take 2 days, but they will do 32 hours of work during that time. So, with twice as much resource, twice as much work gets done, but in the same time. Another possibility is that we still want to get our 16 hours of work done, and we still want to do it in 2 days. But the fact that we've got both Jane and John working on it means that they only each need to devote half their time to it. So we effectively have 3 options. And those 3 options correspond to the 3 options you saw in the previous section when Project 2016 said you've changed information about resourcing on a task. Which of these 3 options would you like to use when you apply that additional resource? Now let me just show you that again. I'm going to now right click on task A. I'm going to click on assign resources. I'm going to choose John, and I'm going to say assign. Now notice the little warning sign on the left there. Now note that Project has assumed that in assigning John, I still want to spend 2 days on this task, but by having that second person we're getting twice as much work done. So let's go over to that warning sign, click on the drop down. The default option there, the middle one, increase the amount of work but keep the same duration. The first one was reduce the duration but keep the same amount of work. So in that case we would have said, well, we're still going to do 16 hours work, but because we've got 2 people on it, we can do it in a day. The third option, reduce the hours resources work per day, the units, but keep the same duration and work. So we say it's still a 2-day task, it's still only going to be 16 hours work, but Jane and John only need to work half the time each. Now let me stick with the default option. And what I want to do now is to show you why that was the default option. Let me open up task A. Now the reason that was the default option was because the task type was declared as fixed duration. And very importantly, the box to the right of that, effort driven, was not checked. So what this says is this task is a fixed duration task. It's a 2-day task. And putting more effort on it will not automatically reduce its duration. So my default is to keep the duration fixed, and therefore if I add resource to it, I'll just get more work done. Let me now look at task B. Now the way that task B is set up is as a fixed work task. So the amount of work is fixed. And all fixed work tasks are effort driven. Note that the effort driven box is checked, but it's greyed out, so I can't change it. Now what do you think will happen if I add an additional resource to this task? It's fixed work, it's effort driven. I'm going to assign John to it. Look what happens. I still get 16 hours work done, but of course now with the additional resource it can be done in 1 day. If I go over to the warning on the left and click on the drop down, the default now reduce the duration but keep the same amount of work. Well, that is the default for a fixed work task, which is always effort driven. But I could say increase the amount of work but keep the same duration. So I could say, well, okay, it's declared to be a fixed work task, but on this occasion I want to actually increase the amount of work, having put the additional resource on. And then I also have the option of reducing the hours resource work per day. So I could say, okay, I'll put a second person on it, it's fixed work, but because I'm not changing the amount of work, each of the resources only needs to work part-time on it to achieve that amount of work. Now on this occasion I'm going to stick with the default, and the duration of that task has been reduced by 1 day. Now let's look at task C, which is a fixed units task, and currently it's not effort driven. Now the significance of the effort driven part is whether in fact what we're trying to do is to do a certain amount of work, to put in a certain amount of effort, and in doing that we are flexing, we're varying the number of people working on it or the duration in order to get that amount done. If a task is not effort driven, then we're not trying to achieve that certain amount of work, put in that certain amount of effort. And if I put more resources onto a task, then all that will happen is that more work gets done. And as a task that's not effort driven, if I assign additional resource, let's go to town this time, let's assign 3 more resources. What is going to happen as I assign a total of 4 people is that we're just getting a lot more work done on that task. Now as usual you've got the warning sign on the left there and you can choose a different option, but basically we're getting the default, which is increase the amount of work but keep the same duration. Now let me undo that particular change. Let's go back in now and make it an effort driven task. Now that means we're trying to achieve a certain amount of work, putting in a certain amount of effort. Now what happens if I assign those 3 extra resources? Given that it's fixed units, what do you think is going to happen? Well, what happens is that the duration is reduced. So in half a day 4 people can do that amount of work. Once again, of course, I can go over to the warning sign and change that if I want to, but basically as it's not fixed duration, putting on that extra number of people means that I can get the work done much more quickly. As I mentioned towards the beginning of this section, we're going to be doing quite a lot on scheduling from now on, and scheduling in Project 2016 can be quite complex at times and requires quite a bit of understanding of what's going on. There is a very useful help article, How Project Schedules Tasks Behind the Scenes, and it's well worth you going through this help article. It's very useful, very well set out, and gives a lot of very useful information. Of course, I will be covering virtually all of this on the course, and quite often in a little more detail than you've got here. But there is a section there, I think it's the 4th one in the list, How do task types affect the schedule? And it sets out for the different task types, fixed units, fixed works, fixed duration, what will happen if you revise units, if you revise duration, if you revise work, and then gives 1 or 2 really good examples of what happens in different situations. So I do suggest that you take some time to go through this, and it will really help you if you can increase the level of your knowledge on scheduling in Project 2016. And another important point here, and I very briefly mentioned this right near the beginning of the course, in project options on the schedule page there are a couple of very important settings. One of them is the default task type. Mine is set to fixed units. I find that that isn't something that I leave set the same way all the time. I often vary this depending on the type of project that I'm planning. Sometimes setting it to fixed duration or fixed work throughout the time that I'm working on a new project in particular can actually save me time. But I've got it set here to fixed units, and the other default here is new tasks are effort driven. In my case, that is not checked. You may find that you prefer your new task to be effort driven, or again you might vary it from job to job. So that's it. We've covered the basics of task types. In the next section we're going to start to look at scheduling itself, so please join me for that. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Project 2016. In this section we're going to start to look at scheduling, and as part of this we have a couple of fundamental things to do to our plan in readiness for actually coming up with a realistic schedule for the wedding. Now the first thing I want to talk about is the difference between manual scheduling and automatic scheduling. And as part of doing that, I want to just explain something about scheduling in Project 2016. If you wanted to take a plan such as this one and schedule it manually, there would be nothing to stop you. Now what I mean by scheduling it manually is that you choose exactly which task starts on which date, and you check that you've got the time to do it, that the resources are available, that your constraints and deadlines are met, and so on. So you can pretty much handcraft the whole schedule. Now in some situations you may have projects where that's exactly what you decide to do, but with a large project with a lot of resources and many constraints, dependencies, etc., that will be a very big job. It will probably take you quite a lot of time to maintain that schedule, particularly if there is a lot of change involved, and particularly if, as the project starts, things start to, shall we say, not go according to plan. Largely speaking, one of the main reasons that people use Project 2016 is to automate the scheduling. Now of course there are many other reasons to use Project 2016, but the automatic side of scheduling is one of the most significant ones, and it's the one that we're going to be concentrating on quite a bit over the coming sections. So my fundamental assumption about the wedding plan, and indeed about the bathroom refit, is that we are going to auto-schedule them. Having said that, and as we're going to see with the wedding schedule, within an auto-scheduled project you may well decide to manually schedule some of the tasks. So for instance in the wedding plan we may well manually schedule the actual wedding date and fix it in time and not allow Project 2016 to change it. But the rest of the schedule we may be quite happy for Project 2016 to auto-schedule. Now one of the things that I haven't done yet and which I need to do now is to resolve the question of when the wedding day will actually be. And at the moment of course, because wedding day task 48 has no predecessors, it's almost the first task in the project, which clearly is not correct. I really need to show that the wedding day is going to happen when everything else is done. I know there'll still be a honeymoon after the wedding date, but the honeymoon itself isn't actually in the schedule at the moment. We've only got making the shortlist and selecting and booking the honeymoon. We don't have the honeymoon itself. So in effect the wedding day is going to be the last task. Now one way of doing this would be to have other summary tasks such as catering, flowers, memories as predecessors of the wedding day. But often when you're starting to get into the scheduling of a project, you decide that one or more tasks or groups of tasks can be separated out into significant phases. And what I'm going to do here is to separate out the wedding day, and I think the rehearsal as well, as, if you like, the last phase of this project. And then what I can do is to say that this last phase has as its predecessor the preparation phase, the phase when all the work on deciding on the venue, booking the flowers, etc. is all done. So what I'm going to do is to take tasks 47 and 48 and separate them out from the rest of the schedule and make them a separate phase. Now, one of the things you need to be careful of here, because I'm going to do a cut and paste, something I haven't much talked about so far, and that is that where you have tasks such as these two, which are subtasks of, in this case, the wedding day summary task, in order to cut them and put them elsewhere, I need to stop them from being subtasks of a summary task. So having selected them, I'm going to outdent them using the button in the schedule group on the task tab. I get a warning. Now you're going to see quite a few of these planning wizard warnings. And this one tells me that if I outdent those two, they will no longer be scheduled as part of the wedding day summary task, and in fact they'll be rescheduled to start before the project start date. Now that sounds a little bit dangerous, but in fact it's something that's going to happen from time to time, this sort of planning wizard warning. And what you can say with confidence in this case is that because I'm going to immediately reschedule those with a different set of rules, this particular planning wizard warning is not one to worry about, because although they will be given a very strange date, it will be for a very short period of time. So I'm going to click on OK to continue and outdent these tasks anyway. Just one word here. Where you get warnings, and many of them will be from the planning wizard, you have this little checkbox in the bottom left hand corner here. Don't tell me about this again. Once you get used to these warnings and maybe they start to irritate you a bit, you can check these boxes so you don't get the same kind of warning again. So on this occasion I'm going to leave the warning switched on, but I'm going to click on OK. The tasks are outdented. Note they're scheduled now right back to actually before the beginning of the project, which is clearly not when wedding day is going to be, but I'm now going to cut those. So I've put the cursor in a row below the end of the schedule, and I'm going to paste those two in. Now once they've been pasted into place, they pick up the indentation, of course, of the task above them, task 49 in this case. I don't want them as part of honeymoon, so I'm going to select both tasks and I'm going to outdent them. I get that same warning again about their scheduling. Again, I'm going to continue, click on OK, and they're back being scheduled far too early. Now let me go back up to the attire task, select that, and do an insert task above that, and that is going to be my task, my summary task for the preparation phase. So let me change the task name, and then what I'm going to do is to select attire, which is now 8, right down to task 50, select honeymoon, and I'm going to indent those to make them part of the phase. And then for the wedding day task down here, that's task 53, its predecessor will be the whole of the preparation phase. So I'm going to put in 7 in the predecessor column, tick on the entry bar tick, and I now have a wedding day on May 24th. Now I know that's not right, but at least I've got a wedding day now, which is at the end of the wedding project. Generally speaking, if you're going to use phases in a project, it's a good idea to do that before you start scheduling, partly for the reason that I've just shown you, where it often makes it much easier to set up dependencies. Now I've got one or two other very small changes here. I'm going to change the name of the task 44. It was called Wedding Day. I've changed it to Wedding Venue. And one particularly useful thing to note there is that Wedding Day, an individual task, has as its predecessor a whole phase, so you really can mix and match these dependencies. The next thing we need to do is to check that our task types are correct. Very often when you're setting up a project, you will have thought carefully about task types. You'll have your default set appropriately, and you'll also want to make sure that any exceptions from the default are set up as well. While we've been setting up the wedding day project, my default has been set to fixed units, as you know. But let me just demonstrate to you now, and bearing in mind what we looked at in the preceding section, that in this particular project, fixed units is not a good choice. Let's go to the select and buy rings task. And let's suppose that the bride and groom look at that task. It's a 4-week task, and they say, well, it's not going to be a full-time job for us to select and buy the wedding rings over that time. Let's say it's only going to take half of our available time. Let's go into the assign resources dialog again. Obviously those two are assigned to that task, but they're assigned 100%. Let's try reducing both of their allocation of time to 50% from 100%. Watch what happens when I reduce the bride's assignment to 50%. As you can see, the task becomes a 40-day task, and the amount of work continues to be set at 320 hours. Now, of course, in this project, the bride and groom's time isn't chargeable, and we're working more on a notional idea of what proportion of their available time is being used on each task. So when we say the bride is 50% allocated, that's just half of the time that she's got available to work on the plans for the wedding. Now, clearly, the idea is not here to extend that task, but to just reflect the fact that the bride's time on it is only going to be half of her available time. So what I'm going to do is to close this, and I'm going to undo that last change. And what I really need to do here is to set the task type for this and effectively every other task in the project to be a fixed duration task. Now, if I want to change a fundamental property of a task, you've already seen I can use the task information dialog. I can also change that for a whole set of tasks by selecting multiple tasks and using the same approach. So what I'm going to do is to select everything from attire, hold the shift key down to select honeymoon, etc. Then with the control key held down, I'm going to make other individual selections. And I'm going to change each of those to be fixed duration. So I click on information, go to the advanced tab, and make sure I have fixed duration and not effort driven. Note where you have a blob like that one, that means you've got a mixture. You've got some that are and some that aren't. I want none of them to be effort driven. Now, you need to be very careful when you transfer what you're looking at here to the bathroom refit project, because the bathroom refit project has a situation with task types that's a little bit different from what we have here in the wedding project. So let's click on OK. That's fine. Now let me go back to that wedding rings task. Just select that. Once again, assign resources. Once again, change it to 50%. Watch what happens this time. Look at the duration and also look at the work. Now what happens is that the amount of work is reduced. The duration is not changed. The bride is shown at 50%. If I now reduce the groom to 50% as well, as you'll see, we're not changing the duration, but we are showing that each of the resources is only needed for 50% of their time over that period. So we've now got what looks like a better project, and you may think that we're coming up to being close to having a workable schedule. But in fact, the schedule we've got is going to present some major problems. And you can see here, for example, if you look at the second half of December, that the major problem is going to be that we have far too many things going on at once. And given that the bride and groom are going to be doing a lot of this work themselves, we are going to find that they are going to be over allocated over some parts of the period of the project. So what I'm going to do now is to quickly go through and allocate the bride and groom to all of the tasks in the schedule that they're going to be responsible for, and you can start to see how we have a scheduling issue. So here I have allocated the bride and groom, sometimes full-time, sometimes with a proportion of their time, and in the left-hand column you can see the little red symbol that indicates that that particular task has over-allocated resources. Now, if I look at the resource sheet, I can see that the two resources that have an over allocation problem, that means that they've just got too much to do over a period of time, are the bride and groom, which is no surprise. And how we resolve those is what we're going to look at in the next section. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this section, it's in our interest to be able to automate the resolution of over allocation of resources. But in order to do that, it's also important to understand the context within which we're working. So, for instance, which things we can delay and which things we can't, and which things we'd prefer not to delay if it can be avoided, and so on. But they're the issues that we're going to look at in the next section when we're going to look at leveling resources. So please join me for that.
To get the Project 2016 course exercise and instructor demo file, click the link below in the video details. You can also scroll through the video details to find each section for this course, in addition to the playlist for the complete course for Microsoft Project 2016. Finally, if you're enjoying this training, please leave us a thumbs up and some comments. Now, let's continue with our Microsoft Project training.
Hello and welcome back to our course on Project 2016. We're starting this section from Wedding 5 and we're going to look at resource leveling. The way we left things in the preceding section is that I had assigned the bride and groom to the tasks for which they have a level of involvement during the planning of the wedding. And we can see that both of them are significantly over allocated, particularly during one period in the second half of December, where they have a lot of different things to be doing all at once. You can see the specific tasks that are over allocated with the indicator in the left hand column there in the display, and as I pointed out to you in the preceding section, if we look at the resource sheet, the two resources there that are marked in red are the ones that are over allocated. And of course in something like this project we don't really have the option of, say, having a couple of extra brides or a couple of extra grooms to spread the work over. In another project, such as for example the bathroom refit, if the tiler or the plasterer or the bathroom fitter had too much work to do, you could possibly get a second person in to help. But that isn't really an option for us here. Now, one of the things that I mentioned in the preceding section, which is of course a very important thing to do, is to make sure that you have your default task type set correctly. Let's just take a look at that now. On the schedule page in project options, in scheduling options for this project, note that I have this project selected, so that's Wedding 5, and the default task type I now have is fixed duration. Note also that I have the checkbox new tasks are effort driven is not checked. Now if I go back to this drop down here, for all new projects my overall default is still a default task type of fixed units. So in the absence of a specific change for a specific project, that is, if you like, my default is fixed units. You will obviously need to set that up in the way that suits you. It's very likely when you are planning projects and as your projects progress that you will experience over allocation of resources, and there are a number of ways of resolving these over allocations, and we're going to be looking at quite a few during the course. But before we do, just one very important point to make is this: there isn't some universal, if you like, panacea for over allocations. There isn't one way of resolving over allocations which is always the right way of doing it. The resolution of over allocations almost always involves understanding the underlying project, the underlying business, the underlying activity that your project relates to, because you have quite a few, if you like, knobs and dials that you can adjust in order to get the best result when you're resolving over allocations. Now, one of the key things you normally need to decide is whether to resolve over allocations manually or automatically. Both of them have a place, and it may well be that you work on the principle that as far as possible you resolve over allocations automatically, but that you'll revert to manual methods where necessary. It actually wouldn't be that complicated for us to go through and resolve all of the over allocations in this particular plan manually. but it can be very time consuming, and automating this process as much as possible is usually the best approach if you can in fact automate it successfully, which is not always the case. Now the first thing I'm going to do is to demonstrate a manual resolution of an overallocation. And I'm just going to take the first overallocation, select wedding dress, and show you very quickly how you could resolve that manually. Now the fact that Project 2016 has put that red marker there that says this task has overallocated resources tells you that it knows there's a problem. It also says right click for options, so let's right click, and we're really interested in the top 3 options. The first of those is Fix in Task Inspector. We're going to look at the Task Inspector later in the course, so we'll come back to that one. And the third one is Ignore Problems for this task. In the same way that in the preceding section once or twice I said let's ignore that warning from the planning wizard, there will be situations where you have an apparent overallocation, but either you know it's not really a problem for reasons I'll look at later on, or you may know that you're going to fix that problem later and you don't need to deal with it now. So you do have the option of ignoring a particular problem related to overallocation. The second option is the one that you'll very often use when you're doing manual resolution, and it is reschedule to available date. And what you're basically saying to Project 2016 is, I want you to find a date when this task can happen and I don't then have an overallocation against it. And that's what we're going to do here, reschedule to available date. Now notice the task has been rescheduled, and also notice that the red marker's gone from the left column there against task with ID 10, and also note that the date, the end date of our project has pushed right out, quite a long way actually, so we've pushed everything related to the wedding dress out to the right, because of course that one task, select wedding dress, had a number of successors including order dress, measurements and fittings, and of course that delays the attire summary task, which in turn delays the whole of the preparation phase. And if we look down here, we'll see now that our wedding date has moved out to June the 10th. Now we could go through each of these overallocated tasks and resolve it manually in that way, but as I say, that would be time consuming, and generally speaking we'd like to automate it. So let's look now at how we might automate this process. Now you might be tempted in this situation to undo what we just did and start again with an automated version of this process. But before we do, I want to demonstrate something else. I'm going to change the view, and the view we're going to use is one specifically that we use when we're working on leveling resources. So I'm going to click on View, and I'm going to go for Other Views, More Views, and I'm going to choose Leveling Gantt. Now the Leveling Gantt view effectively shows you what Project 2016 is doing in terms of leveling the resources on a project. Now when you apply a new view like this, it's very often the case that the timescale is all completely wrong. So let's go for entire project so that we see the project on the right there. And you note in particular this little coloured bar here against select wedding dress. That bar represents the leveling delay, the amount of delay that was added to that when we did the manual leveling just now. And we have in fact a set of tools to handle leveling delays. Now before I use one of those tools, look at the table on the left. Let me just make the name column a little bit wider. There is a column there, leveling delay, and the current leveling delay on that task is 42 E-days. E-days are elapsed days. So when we did the manual resource leveling just now, what Project 2016 had to do was to delay that task by 42 elapsed days, and that's the currently applied leveling delay to that task. Now notice that its successor tasks, which were also delayed, were not delayed because of leveling of themselves. They were delayed because we delayed the select wedding dress task that had the resource over allocation. So their leveling E-days are set at 0 days. They weren't delayed because of a leveling problem. They were delayed because they are successors of a task that had a leveling problem. Now, if I wanted to put this particular project back the way that it was, I could obviously do the undo, but I also can go to the Resource tab and click on a button there, Clear Leveling in the Level group. Watch what happens if I clear the leveling. I get an option of clearing it for the whole project, or if I'm just working on part of the project, or I want to clear the leveling on part of the project, I can select the relevant tasks and change this option to selected tasks. As I've only done one bit of leveling here, I'll stick with the entire project, click on OK, and basically what happens is that task goes back to where it was before. And if I now reverted back to the Gantt chart view, it would look exactly how it looked before. And of course I've got my over allocation indicator on the left there for task ID 10. Now, before we look at automatically leveling, let me just point something else out. We asked Project 2016 to reschedule Select Wedding Dress to a date where the resource wouldn't be over allocated. You can reschedule these things completely manually yourself, so there will be nothing to stop me going into any of these tasks and changing the start and finish dates. And I could go through all of them and change their start and finish dates manually, schedule them manually, change their task types from auto scheduled to manually scheduled if necessary, and fix any of these dates in time if I wanted to. But what we want to look at now is the opposite of doing that, and that is putting everything in Project 2016's hands and seeing if it can resolve these over allocations automatically. So I'm back in regular Gantt chart view, and I go to the Resource tab, and in that level group that we saw just now, there are two buttons there. There's Level Resource and Level All. Level Resource gives me the ability to level one or more selected resources. So if all I wanted to do was to level the bride and make sure that she's not over allocated, I can select one resource and click on Level Now. And Project 2016 will try to level the bride over the project so that she's not over allocated at any stage. Now, it's important to recognize it will try, because it may well be that the constraints, the deadlines, the dependencies, they may mean that she cannot be leveled. There are going to be situations where she's just got too much to do over a period of time. So you may find in many of your projects that you can't completely resolve over allocations, or should I say, not in a way that you're happy with. You may have to make some compromises or other changes in order to achieve a completely leveled project. So that's leveling an individual resource. The Level All button basically levels all resources, and if I click on Level All, let's see what happens. I will normally get one or more warnings, and this is a warning. Note the yellow triangle on the left there. Project cannot resolve the over-allocation of bride on Thursday, July 14th. When you get these, there are often three choices. The first choice is to continue working on other over-allocated resources, click Skip. To continue leveling and skip over-allocations that cannot be resolved, click Skip All. So if there's a problem found here and I'm going to say, well, let's just keep going, and whatever problems you find, just keep skipping them and leave the problems and I'll sort them out later. And the third option is to stop leveling, click on Stop. Now what I'm going to do here is to say Skip All, and then having clicked on Skip All, we'll see how many of the resource over allocations Project 2016 can resolve. And there we are. Now, as you can see, most of the red markers in the first column have gone, and our wedding is now on August the 1st. So the date's pushed out a long way. Don't forget that little deadline marker there. You see we're still a month short of our deadline marker, so that's not too bad. But we do still have some over allocations, and if I click on the resource sheet, you'll see that both the bride and the groom still have over allocation issues. Now clearly we're going to need to look at those outstanding over allocations to find out what's causing them and whether we can resolve them or what we have to change to resolve them. But when we look at the schedule itself, we may well find issues with that. Overall, there are some very good aspects of the schedule now because, for example, we have the reception venue identified, we have the wedding venue identified, and they're both done before we send out the invitations, which is pretty good. We also have the wedding itself registered and licensed early on. But when we look at things like caterer, baker, florist and so on, we're making the shortlist and then there's a long time before we book those people, and the booking is probably a little bit too late in the day. Ideally, we seem to have left the bookings much too late in the process. Whereas with other aspects such as the wedding rings, maybe they're roughly in the right kind of place. But quite often when you look at a schedule after leveling, you'll find that the resulting schedule doesn't really tie in with the ideal sequence of events. And there are a number of options that you can apply when leveling to help you to get just the kind of sequence of events that you want, while still resolving any over allocations. And the use of those options is what we're going to look at in the next section. So please join me for that. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Project 2016. In the preceding section we did a little bit of manual resource leveling in order to try to overcome over allocations of the bride and groom's time in our wedding plan. Now what we're going to do in this section is to look at automating the leveling of resources in Project 2016. And primarily we're going to look at the options that are available when you're doing this. Now before we start, I should point out that when we did the leveling before, we came up with a schedule that indicated a potential wedding day of August the 1st. That's a good starting point. I think we may go for a date a little bit later than that, but first of all we need to make sure that all of our issues are overcome. It may well be that that appears to be a good date and the plan appears to work, but until you've actually looked at any outstanding issues, you can't really be certain that the end date, in this case the wedding date, is going to be achievable. The other thing to bear in mind is that with any project you are dependent on making sure, for example, that you have all of the tasks, dependencies, etc. in place, that your estimates, your time estimates, your resource estimates are good, and that your resources are going to be available. We're going to take a look at some of the things that might go wrong a little bit later on in the course, but for the moment let's assume that our resources are available and that we're pretty much scheduling this project on the basis that, given that a lot of it is down to the bride and groom, they're going to be very committed to getting the wedding running to schedule, and that therefore they'll be more than happy to put in that extra bit of effort to deal with any problems that arise. Now the first thing that I'm going to do is to undo the leveling that we did in the previous section. And if I go to the resource tab in the level group, one of the options is clear leveling. Look carefully at the schedule, particularly around the area of select and order wedding dress. Clear the leveling for the entire project and we're back to where we were. Now what we're going to try to do is to level automatically, and before we do that let's look at leveling options. Now the resource leveling dialog has many options and we're going to look at a few of them in this section. One or two we're going to save until later on in the course. Now first of all, do you want leveling calculations to be automatic or manual? I normally set this at manual because whilst having Project 2016 automatically deal with leveling can work quite well, when you're setting up a project it can actually be rather annoying because you get to a situation where it's leveling resources and you're thinking to yourself, well hang on a minute, I've got loads more tasks and resources to put in yet. So you're doing work that is really a waste of time, because until all of the project or the bulk of the project is in, there's not really any point in doing this. So I tend to go for manual leveling calculations. The next option, look for over allocations on a default day-by-day basis. You can also have minute by minute, hour by hour, down to month by month. This is a very important option. I'm going to explain it to you with an example. Let's suppose that you have somebody doing a task for 2 hours a day over the course of a week. And maybe it's the only job they've got to do on a project. But on Wednesday, you need them to do a full day task. So they've got an 8-hour job to do on Wednesday. If you have over allocations being looked for on a day-by-day basis, Project 2016 will look at Wednesday and say they're over allocated because they've got 2 hours on the first task and 8 hours on the second task. That's 10 hours. That's too much work. But if instead I said on a week-by-week basis, what Project 2016 will do is to say, let's add up that first task a week, 5 days, 2 hours, that's 10 hours. Let's add the time for the second task. That's 8 hours. That's a total of 18 hours. Oh, they've got plenty of time in a week to do 18 hours of work. So as far as Project 2016 is concerned, in that case, they are not over allocated. Basically, what Project 2016 is doing is leveling out, evening out the work. Now, it may be important to you to get Project 2016 to even out that work, and week by week for that reason may be a good option. Month by month might be a good option. But if you really do need to make sure that they're not over allocated on even 1 day or 1 hour or 1 minute, and that the tasks they're being given are not of a nature where the resource can balance the time out themselves over the course of, say, a day or a week, then you need to make sure you have the correct values set. Now, in the case of the wedding, where we're not really that concerned about exactly what hours are being worked, the bride and groom have indicated the proportion of the time that they need on each task, I'm going to be quite happy with week by week leveling. The next option is the leveling range. Do I want to level an entire project, or do I want to just level a certain date range? What can sometimes happen when you're working on a long project is you may, for example, have the project in phases, and over the next phase, say the next few months, it may be important that you have the resources leveled. But for phases of a project which are much further off into the future, leveling resources may be a bit of a waste of time because you don't really have the detail in yet. There's a lot more work to do on it. So leveling resources over that period really is a waste of time and will flag problems that don't really yet exist. So in that situation, you might want to choose just say the next few months to level. On this occasion, we're going to level the entire project. The next option we're going to look at in the resource leveling dialog relates to leveling order. But in fact, I'm going to cover that last. I want to look at the checkboxes below that first, because I'm just going to briefly review those. First of all, there's an option level only within available slack. Now, we're going to talk about slack and the critical path later on in the course, but basically, if I check the box that says level only within available slack, that means that leveling will be done in such a way that the end date of the project is not delayed. Now, this may well constrain how successful leveling can be, but it does mean that we can be certain that this isn't going to cause a delay in the project. At the moment, that is unchecked, so any leveling we do may well delay the end of the project. The second option, leveling can adjust individual assignments on a task. Rather than move a task and of course the assignments associated with it for all of the resources that are assigned to that task, it can adjust individual assignments. So it could take one resource and adjust that resource's assignment on a task in order to overcome an over allocation issue. That's currently checked, so we're allowing that. And the third option there, leveling can create splits in remaining work. You may recall that when I did that manual leveling exercise and it moved some of the tasks associated with attire out to the right, you may have noticed that one of the tasks was actually split into two with a sort of dashed line between the two halves. What Project can do is to split outstanding tasks and say we're going to do part of the job, then we're going to take a break from it, then we're going to do the other part of the job. And this is on the basis that in that gap in the middle, the resources working on the task are needed to do something else. Again, that is allowed now, so I am allowing Project 2016 to create splits in remaining work. The fourth option, level resources with the proposed booking type, is one we're not really going to cover on this course. You can really have two types of booking. You can have a proposed booking and a confirmed booking. Now, as I say, the use of these booking types is outside the scope of what we're covering on this course. But later on in your use of Project 2016, when you start looking at proposed and confirmed booking types, that's an important option to be aware of when you're leveling. The fifth option dictates whether leveling can be applied to manually scheduled tasks. Now, generally speaking, by default, we don't level manually scheduled tasks, but if you do want to include manually scheduled tasks in the leveling operation, check that box. So that's that group of 5 options. One or two of them we'll come up against later on in the course, and let's concentrate now on leveling order. In Project 2016, there are 3 options for leveling order, and by default, the leveling order here is standard. And with standard, what basically happens is Project 2016 uses all of the information you've given it about resources, tasks, dependencies, constraints, etc., and does the best job that it can to level the resources on the project, subject of course to the various options that we've been looking at so far in this section. But you have 2 other options. Now, these 2 options are very different, but as I'm sure you appreciate by now, even using the same terminology and looking at the same types of problem on 2 different projects, you very often take a very different approach to solving a problem. Now, the first other option is what's called ID only. And the way that ID only leveling works is that the leveling is done strictly in terms of the ID numbers. They're the numbers, the leftmost numbers that you can see in the table in the Gantt chart. So task 1, task 2, task 3 and so on. The higher the number, the more likely it is to be leveled. I mentioned to you very, very early on in the course that there's absolutely no reason that you put the tasks here in, if you like, chronological order or any other order for that matter. But many people do put tasks in an order whereby if leveling is to occur, then the ones that are, if you like, further down the schedule, the ones with the higher ID numbers, will tend to be leveled, to be delayed most. Now, that usually corresponds with the general concept that the tasks near the beginning of the schedule are the ones that are done first, and the ones near the end are the ones that are done last. So with ID only, that's the rule that Project 2016 follows. Now, I should point out, of course, that it will still obey all of the rules in terms of dependencies, etc., that you have set up in the project. It doesn't ignore those. What happens with ID only, though, is that where there is a conflict, where there is a decision to make, the tasks with the higher IDs are the ones that will tend to be delayed. The other option is priority and then standard. And what happens with this is that you give project some guidelines on the basis of priority. So let's suppose we have a particular task that we definitely don't want to be delayed. We know it's involved in an over-allocation issue, but we don't want it to be delayed. What we would do is to give that task a higher priority than all of the other tasks. Similarly, if we had a particular task, wherever it was in the schedule, it wouldn't matter whether it was near the beginning or the end, wherever it was, and we really didn't mind that task being delayed, then we would give that task a lower priority, and that would tend to reduce its chance of being delayed as part of the leveling process. So first of all, what I'm going to do is to try just to use standard leveling and see what sort of result we get. So I select standard, click on level all, and Project 2016 comes up with a new schedule. Now, you're going to see some problems with this schedule straight away. The number of red over-allocation indicators is greatly reduced, so that's good. You won't necessarily always see all of them disappear, and sometimes you need a certain amount of manual work to resolve the ones that remain. But let's look first at our end date. Well, our end date is now September 12th, so that's maybe not too bad. We could maybe resolve that few days delay or even put back the date to that early date in September, even though we'd set our deadline of September the 1st. But if you look at some of the issues are actually quite extreme. For instance, we've got a problem here, make caterer shortlist, book caterer. There's a huge gap between them. There's clearly some work needed there on the scheduling because we don't want that huge long gap and we don't want to leave those bookings to be quite so late in the day. But perhaps even more importantly, the ordering of the dress and the measurement and fittings and the attire generally is being left right until the very last minute, which doesn't really seem like a good idea. So standard leveling hasn't really done the job for us on this occasion. So let's undo that leveling and let's try setting one or two priorities. Now, one of the things that takes a little bit of getting used to when you're doing leveling is that there are quite a few options, and although I'm going to demonstrate priorities now, you may alternatively choose, for example, to fix some of these tasks in time and say to decide on the first few tasks, set a constraint that they must start on a certain date, or even make them manually scheduled tasks. But let's suppose the first thing that I'm going to try is to say, well, the most important thing to get started with is to sort out the guest list and the invitations. And of course, as part of that, we're going to need to book the venue so that we can send out the invitations, and we're going to need to have decided on the actual date and so on. Most of that is covered by the dependencies that we've already set up. But let's go into Make Guest List and change its priority from 500 to 600. So we're making that the highest priority task. And then we're going to do the same for sending out the invitations. Let's say that's 600 as well. And then let's go into leveling options and choose priority standard as our leveling order and see what happens. Now when we do that, not only do we finish up again with just a few over allocation markers on the left, but we also finish up with a date of August the 16th. So we've actually come up with a better solution, and we probably have less problems. I haven't counted them all. We've still got the problem with the attire, but as you can see, we've got a much shorter project, and of course we've got the making of the guest list and the sending out of the invitations happening as early as they can in the process. Don't forget, as part of getting ready to send the invitations, we do have to sort out the venue. So having sorted out that particular issue, we might now turn our attention to the attire and give that a higher priority than it currently has, and maybe also look at some of the other tasks, perhaps ones which could do with a lower priority. Things like the florist. We may decide that the florist is one of the last things we would need to do. But in that way, with selective use of priorities, we should be able to come up with a pretty good schedule. And it looks as though we might yet achieve our September the 1st date. However, I'm going to stop working on this particular schedule for the moment because I want to do a little bit more work on these outstanding over allocations. And what I want to do instead is to give you a chance to try a little bit of resource leveling and scheduling now on the bathroom refit project. And we're going to do that in exercise 4. That's going to be covered in the next section. I'll see you then. Welcome back to our course on Project 2016. In this section I'm going to set you exercise 4. This is a reasonably straightforward exercise, but it takes a little bit of explaining. I'm starting you with a version of the bathroom refit project, version 4A, and I have set up some resources, but I'm only really concerned here with resources on the second part of the project. So for the first 2 phases, the parts that I'm effectively going to do myself, where I'm going to do things like look into the colour scheme and the tiles and all those things, I'm not really too worried about resourcing those. In fact, with those, I've generally set the task type to fixed duration. But later on in the project, for the implementation phase and the completion phase, I've allocated some resources. These are people I'm going to employ to do the work on the refit for me. As you can see, we have some resource over allocation issues, and if we just look now at the resource sheet, you'll see that I've set up an electrician, a plumber and a contractor. The contractor is basically a general builder, somebody who's able to do most of the jobs that I'm going to need doing in this bathroom refit. As you can see, it's the contractor who is over allocated. Now the first thing I'd like you to do is to move the start date of the project to tomorrow. That is your tomorrow, not my tomorrow when I'm recording this course, but your tomorrow, as though you're actually going to start doing all of this work from tomorrow. Now when I move my start date to tomorrow, I finish up with an end date of March the 4th. Now clearly it's very unlikely you'll finish up with the same end date as me, but make a mental note of that end date, because the next step is to level the resources, and in order to do that I want you to use the standard leveling, and I want you to do it in such a way that you're quite happy for the refit complete date to move out to be later on, and I want you to do it on a week by week basis. So that's the first exercise. Now when I do that, my refit complete date goes back about 10 days, and you should find that yours goes out about 10 days as well. So given this one contractor and given the electrician and the plumber and the plan that I've got here, I can stick with those resources and it will delay the end date by about 10 days. So that's the first part of the exercise. If you get a slightly different date to that, bear in mind it could just be the way that your weekends are falling, or you may even have put some public holidays in, but more of that later on. Then what I want you to do is to clear the leveling again. So basically go back to the start point, so I'm back to March the 4th. Now what I want you to do is to level those resources on a day-by-day basis, but without changing the end date. So the end date is still going to be March the 4th in my case, or whatever your starting end date is, if you like, the end date you got straight after you move the start date of the project. Now, obvious question is, how am I going to do that? How am I going to keep the same end date and clear the over allocations? The answer to that is you're going to use more contractors. The question for you is, how many more do you need to use? My answer to that is in 4B. Good luck with that. I'll see you in the next section.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To get the Project 2016 course exercise and instructor demo file, click over here. And click over there to watch the complete 7-hour beginner course for Microsoft Project 2016.